Father kindly said he'd sort of manage that but you're most welcome just to interrupt me at any point whatsoever. I'm just going to try and make sure I can present properly. Right. So, sorry, just to confirm, Father, can everyone see this?
Yes, we can see. Looks good.
Right, great. Yes, very briefly. Yes, sorry. I do teach at the University of Cape Town, and one of my research sort of areas is actually ancient Greek philosophy. I've been teaching ancient Greek there since 1988, so I'm time for me to retire. The reason I thought, we thought this might be interesting is, of course, as Father said, the New Testament scriptures are written in Greek. And not only that, of course, but what interests me a little bit is the way in which, at least the Greek-speaking members of the Roman Empire and further afield than that, quite often would have accessed information about Christianity in Greek, no matter what other language they might have been speaking. But also they would have, especially those who had had a formal education, would have had some sort of acculturation in ancient Greek pagan systems of thought. And I just thought that it'd be interesting to sort of look at some of those in terms of divinity. And also, of course, the issue of, some of the great church fathers who clearly saw that there was something worth preserving in pagan Greek writing. We wouldn't have any of this stuff, don't forget, if it hadn't been actually for Christian Greeks preserving it for us. So they clearly thought it was worth preserving, and I think it's quite interesting knowing a little bit about it. So I'll just start with a few brief remarks about the Greek language, because it might much of this might be known to you already, so forgive me. But you probably aware, of course, that Greek is part of this enormous family of so-called Indo-European languages. It's an interesting one because it's sort of out on its own a little bit. It's a bit like languages like Armenian. There are no sort of close kind of siblings of Greek. It's quite a unique and intriguing language. And one also always has to remember that ancient Greek was not something spoken just in what we might think as the core area, the sort of approximating to the modern nation state of Greece by any means. Although we think it sort of took its shape in that peninsula more broadly, certainly by already 1000 BC, if not before. Greek language had spread throughout many areas of the Mediterranean, both to the east and right up into the Black Sea. There were many colonies, even in the west, particularly southern Italy, southern France, and even on the eastern coast of Spain and a little bit of North Africa. So it was a very widely distributed language. I always tell the students that one should think of the ancient Greeks as really a diaspora culture more than anything else in many ways. Diaspora culture is a useful way of thinking of these people. Of course, by what we might call the historical period, by which I mean when we start having texts, we get a picture of a sort of dialect spread of Greek. So Greek is not just one monolithic language. There were many dialects that evolved. We think that Greeks probably entered what is now, I suppose, the Greek peninsula roughly at about 2000 BC. And as we'll see in a second, our first evidence for the Greek language really only comes up in about 1500 BC through these remarkable texts which are preserved. We'll look at a couple of those in a moment. But already by, certainly the sort of classical period, so from 700 BC onwards, roughly, there are many dialects spread all over this region. And they are to some extent mutually intelligible, but I think some Greeks in one dialect might have had considerable difficulty understanding someone until they got acclimatized to slight differences in grammar and pronunciation and things like that. We don't have time to go into those, but they are interesting. Maybe just one example. It's a very small one. So in Athens, they would have pronounced the word for God as theos, but in Sparta, they would have said Sios. All right, so you know, it's kind of, you could understand, probably a bit like Londoners trying to understand Scottish English, or someone from Glasgow, maybe. So as I said, you know, we do have evidence from about 1,500, 1,400 of ancient Greek, but this came in the form of these rather strange sort of tablets, which are written in a syllabary, which wasn't really deciphered until the 1950s. As a little remarkable incident. I'll show a slide of that in a moment. But all we have here, we've got many thousands of these tablets which were preserved because they were written on clay, and then the palace in which they were sort of written, being stored, sort of caught on fire. So the clay tablets were obviously made a lot more permanent and hardened. And archaeologists in the 19th century and 20th centuries recovered these and continue to recover them. And it was only discovered in the 1950s that they actually are Greek. The writing system is not actually adapted very well for writing Greek. It's a syllabic script, so it doesn't do consonant clusters very, very well. But it was remarkable that we discovered this, and it's really enriched our knowledge of the history of ancient Greek. It really has. We can kind of now look at certain things and see how words evolve and things like that. The key text, which unlocked this was a remarkable tablet, which is not a very good slide, but you might be able to make it out. On the left-hand side, this is a transcription made by Michael Ventris, who was key in deciphering this script, and he sort of kind of just tried something. If you look at the very bottom, I don't know if you can see it there, but there's a bottom. There's a thing that looks like a vessel with 3 legs on it. He made a pretty good guess. That's probably a symbol for a tripod. And then there's like 2 little kind of strokes. And he thought, well, that's probably 2. So maybe it's 2 tripods. So he tried giving a sort of value to these particular sort of symbols here. And he gave the value, so he found out that if you give them the value tripode, because they're sort of 4 syllables, that it's probably an attempt in this syllabary to render it as tripode, which basically is even the classical Greek for 2 tripods. Remember that ancient Greek does have a dual number as well as a singular and a plural. And through that breakthrough, we were able to eventually acquire a value for most, nearly all of these strange signs, and we worked out that they're actually syllables.
Chrysostom,
yes.
That script, where did they pick it up from?
It's a very good question. I think that this is not my area of expertise, I have to be honest, but there are similar looking scripts which were developed on Crete for a completely different language, which have still not been deciphered. It's known as Linear A. This is Linear B, and it's thought that the Greek speakers adapted this form of writing to their own language in some way or other, and so they were adapting a system of writing that wasn't really well suited to their own language.
So whatever language was probably not an Indo-European language.
Okay. Absolutely. Sorry, it sounds like Vasily. Yes, absolutely. That is absolutely true. I think nearly everybody thinks that it's highly likely that language in Linear A is not, in fact, an Indo-European language. The whole area of the ancient languages of this part of the Mediterranean is fascinating. I mean, the Greeks themselves had various sort of theories about it. They spoke about the early people as Pelasgians, the people that they kind of found. And of course, a number of ancient Greek words which are clearly not Indo-European, particularly a lot of place names like the word Corinth, Corinthos. Any of those words in Greek are actually not Indo-European. And even a basic word like anthropos, which I think nearly everybody knows, it means a human being or a man. That word is actually not an Indo-European word, interestingly enough. Yeah, it's a fascinating field. So,
you.
of course, luckily for us, after the destruction of these old palace centers and the collapse of writing, which, funnily enough, went on to survive. We haven't got time to go into that, but went on to survive, funnily enough, on the island of Cyprus. So Cyprus continued using this a sort of a version of Linear B, funnily enough, to do Greek in. They were very conservative, excuse me, but. Yeah, so the ancient Greeks basically adapted, it's a work of genius, they adapted a northwestern Semitic alphabet, which had been established for a long, long time, probably an alphabet very close to the alphabet used by the Phoenicians. But they did some radical things to it, they really did. And the most radical thing they did, of course, was to use some of the signs which had been used in Semitic for a particular consonant, which the Greeks didn't have and didn't need. They adapted that sign to mark vowels. Because if you look at, say, Phoenician alphabet, sorry, this is just something I managed to find on the net, but, there actually aren't any vowel sounds, generally speaking, in Semitic alphabets. They're just consonants. And the vowels are supplied by your own knowledge of the language. So you kind of supplied the vowels, a bit like writing an entire sort of English passage just using consonants. Now, that might sound odd to us, but people have done experiments, and you actually can read English when you get used to it. You just supply you just supply the vowel. You actually don't really need the consonants. And that raises another issue we can't get into here is, why did the Greeks actually put vowels in? Because these writing systems didn't need them. Some people said, oh, well, it's because Semitic languages kind of are easier to work out if you don't have vowels. No, that's nonsense. That's been proven to be incorrect. There's a lovely, attractive theory, which I'm not sure, can be proven. Of course, it can't be proven, and but it's a really attractive theory, and that is that the ancient Greeks invented the vowel, if you like, in the alphabet in order to be able to write poetry. And it's very strange that I think to date, our earliest continuous example of ancient Greek writing, and this dates to about 730 BC, roughly 720, comes from a little cup that was found by archaeologists on the island of Ischia, which is off the west coast of Italy, off the coast of Naples. So it's actually not even in Greece itself or the Greek heartland. And scratched, you can probably just make out the scratching in this rather bad photograph from the museum there, on the kind of central panel, as it were, of what remains of this cup. There's a more helpful drawing of it on the right-hand side. Look at the top right one, because that's all we've got. The bottom right panel with the writing is actually an attempt to render it with all the gaps. And I just wonder if you can actually see it. Sorry, again, I don't have a pointer, but at this top line on the top right, you might be able to make out letters. It's actually Nestoros. Maybe you can see that. It's from right to left, because early Greek writing very often was like the Semitic, from right to left. Sometimes what they call boustrophedon, where they start from the right, then you get to the end of the line, and then you start writing from the left. You have to keep reversing your handwriting. And then the next line, it's called boustrophedon because it's like from the bous and the stroph, the idea of turning with the ox, with your plow when you're furrowing. And this text is the following. I am the cup of Nestor, good for drinking. Whoever drinks from this cup, straightway desire for beautifully crowned Aphrodite will seize him. So this is our first alphabetical writing in ancient Greek. And the lines are poetry. We can identify these two lines as what we call dactylic hexameters, which was the same line of poetry used by Homer and Hesiod. We'll talk about those in a second. The first line is more problematic. We're not quite sure what meter that's in. But the figure of Nestor, I mean, he's actually a character in epic poetry, in the Trojan epic cycle. He's this old warrior who kind of bores everybody by talking about the good old days and how warriors were much better in those days and they're much worse than they are. So it's a remarkable text. So our first writing in Greek is not like a label saying olive oil and wine, which might be quite useful if you want to know whether to open something or not before you kind of smell it. You can actually see. They don't use it for that. They use it actually for something else, for writing poetry. All right, so very briefly then, the evolution of the Greek language. So we have this evidence from Mycenaean times. We call it the Mycenaean civilization. That takes us down roughly to 1200 BC. And as we said, that's in linear B syllabograms. That's really just kind of records of inventories of offerings and rations given to slave women and all that kind of thing. It's basically Greek used by accountants, for want of a better word, or quantity sort of quantity surveyors, perhaps.
Chrysostom,
yes.
I was just wondering, does Greek poetry from that period when the alphabet was developed, is there sort of heavy use of assonance or something like that in there, like
yes,
internal
absolutely.
rhyming, and that maybe more so than other languages that may have driven them to bother to put the vowels in.
Yeah, it's so hard to know. It really is. I think one of the reasons might be perhaps because of the. Sorry, this is maybe taking us a bit away, but I've got a pet theory about this. I've got a fear that if you want to support the idea that vowels are there because of the alphabet's potential as a conveyor of poetry, that it's necessary to do that because you have a language which is split into many different dialects. So
that's true, because it wouldn't work if you then said it in another dialect.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So just to maybe, that's a very good point. Excellent. Okay, so before the effort of writing, we know that something's going on, but it's a kind of a black hole, unfortunately. So 1200 BC to about 750 BC, when the alphabet is established and begins to be established, we should say, we clearly know that the dialects are developing and also being distributed territorially across not only the Eastern Mediterranean, particularly to the west coast of Turkey, but also, of course, to the west, to southern Italy, and of course Sicily. So where it really becomes, useful for us is when we get to the Archaic period. So that's 750 to 500 BC, very, very roughly. That's when we're looking at textual evidence for Greek. That's where it becomes really, really clear. And there are a variety of dialects that that emerge from that. I'm not going to go through them all by any means, except maybe note, the second on the list there, Attic Ionic. That's the one that's most influential on the development of what we're going to call Koine Greek. The other dialects are less important in that respect. The earliest texts, interestingly, like Homer and Hesiod, which we can date to roughly 700 BC in the original format. These are interestingly written, actually, or composed, because we think they were primarily oral poems, but they were composed in a literary dialect, actually, that no one really spoke. Probably one that was almost a sort of a poetic language. And that had a strong Ionic basis, so it's closer to what emerges as Athenian Greek, funnily enough. So it came from it's associated particularly with the western coast of what is now modern Turkey, so-called Ionia. But there's also lyric poetry, and from that material we get a lot of information about the dearest dialects, including Ionic, Laconian, and very importantly Lesbian, which of course was spoken on the island of Lesbos, which is another dialect. The dialect associated with the great poet Sappho, which most of you have heard of, and people like Alcaeus and others. And in addition to that, we have a lot of inscriptions. Well, when I say a lot, they start off being very, very few of them, the early ones, but then they kind of become more and more of them. By the 500s BC, we've got quite a lot of information, and so we can pick up more information there on the dialects. But of course, everyone thinks of ancient Greek, they tend to think of the classical period, and they tend to think of actually Athenian Greek. That's the Greek that's best attested historically anyway, because we have the largest corpus of literary texts from that. So all your great dramatic texts, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the three great tragedians, Aristophanes. Remember, these poets were preserved by the Byzantines. They selected some key plays and they decided, that's the selection we're going to have for our school syllabus. And that's why we have them. Historians like Thucydides and Xenophon, those are also writing in Athenian Greek or Attic Greek, if you like. Again, the ancients and then the Christians, the Byzantines, preserved that material because it provided them with historical accounts, with narratives. They want to know about the past. They select some key individuals who were very, very, kind of important as representatives, and they cover particular periods, because no one likes a great, vacuum or gaping hole in your past. You want to know what happened. Herodotus, interestingly, who's wonderful, of course, he writes in a slightly different dialect. He writes in Ionic dialect. And then, of course, we've got a lot of oratory, the great Athenian orators who were politicians and people composing forensic speeches. And, of course, which is probably more relevant what we're talking about today, the great philosophers, people like Plato and Aristotle. And these are, considerable amounts of work. There's, multi-volume Plato and Aristotle. It's quite a lot. Yeah. Sorry, was there a question? Okay. Now, of course, things changed somewhat after Alexander the Great. So, Alexander the Great sort of dies, 323 BC, I think it is. And then we kind of left with this enormous sort of swathe of the world, if you like, which is now sort of under the successors, the so-called diadochi. Yes, sorry, was there a question?
Is there a question? I heard something. Okay, probably not.
Sorry.
I'll read some. There's a couple of questions on the chat, but we'll wait till the end, I think.
Okay, so the successors, they carve out their share of the empire. Obviously, the borders move between these an awful lot over time. But effectively, because the Macedonians, and Alexander was a Macedonian, had sort of tried to be as Greek as they possibly could, and had particularly targeted Athenian Greek as the Greek they wanted to speak. Interestingly, they spread, if you like, the language primarily of the Athenians throughout these parts of the world, into Egypt, into what is now sort of places like Iraq and Syria, and even further afield into places like Afghanistan. So that's why we have Greek in places like the Holy Land, I suppose, because Greek was the language of their administration, and of course of the elite culture. And I suppose there's this sort of trickle-down effect as well into people who are below the elite. So that's really why we have Greek, and it becomes this international language. And we have effectively the evolution of something that comes, funnily enough, by the ancients themselves to be called the Koine. So it's a language which is, as I said, largely Athenian Greek, with certain adaptations, certain changes, and as we'll see, although it's Athenian, what you tend to find is it's regarded now as a common language. It becomes a standard sort of variety. It's Pan-Hellenic. It becomes, if you like, a lingua franca. Always remember that, strictly speaking, we have no direct access to the way actual people, real life people spoke, unfortunately, because everything we have is textualized. There are no recordings of people speaking. But again, depending on your point of view, we might actually have some quite good idea if we look at personal letters written by normal people in ancient Egypt, who are writing in Greek to one another, schoolboys asking for more money from their mother and father, while they're away, all these little kind of things. And, people who specialize in that area kind of probably feel that they're getting pretty close to the way people spoke. It's always a controversial category, this koine. The ancients called it the he koine dialectos. So it's not just reserved for, say, something like New Testament Greek. And what we're dealing with really is something that has really higher and lower manifestations. It's a bit of a waste paper basket term in some ways. So it would include highly educated people like Plutarch, And of course, highly educated people like some of the church fathers, who are writing in this very, very thing. And at the same time, of course, you have the New Testament, which could also be classified as Koine. Maybe a little bit on that, scriptural Greek. Well, of course, Father has spoken about this frequently, and most people know about it. The fact that the ancient Hebrew scriptures were translated probably from the 3rd century BC, of course, by and for Hellenized Jewish communities of Alexandria. There's a suspicion by some scholars that some Jews outside the Holy Land kind of didn't feel very confident actually in Hebrew, and so needed Greek translations. Some people, and I think they're a minority, have regarded this Greek as actually something entirely invented, if you like, to translate Hebrew in. Some people have called it translation Greek, but the majority of people regard it as a Greek which is serving a very specific purpose. Now, the New Testament, of course, always remembering, we assume, I suppose, that the mother tongue of the gospel writers and Paul was Aramaic, but the Greek of the New Testament reflects the normal bilingualism of the educated people of this region. And again, various stages of education. You don't have to have had advanced secondary education to be able to write in Greek, by no means. So perhaps unsurprisingly, most scholars, as I understand it, again, I must stress this is not my field, would say that Greek displays in the New Testament, various degrees of literary sophistication and style, and that there's a tendency perhaps to sort of prefer clarity and accessibility over elegance. But of course, there are some incredibly elegant sections of the New Testament. Even someone who's more attuned, if you like, to pagan Greek finds that. It's remarkable. And of course, a lot of the idioms are frequently informed by knowledge of the Septuagint. So, the Septuaginta translation is also kind of informing, I suppose, the style of this Greek. So in the interest of time, because obviously we, I don't want to keep you more than another half hour, I just thought we now to maybe talk a little bit about the kind of concepts of divinity, perhaps, that are part of this world, which I suppose Christianity confronts. And, these are some of the things that people, finding Christianity in those early centuries, kind of, in a sense, this is the sort of, the kind of mental map that they're sort of working with, and one, because I'm assuming that, obviously there were a lot of Jews, presumably, who were early Christians, but what I'm really interested in are the people who weren't Jews, who for whom these concepts that are coming across are quite different in many respects. But perhaps maybe only superficially there are points of contact. Now, I love this text. I always give this text to the students. It's from a great lyric poet of the sort of early 400s BC. So he's working between sort of about 480 BC to about 460 BC, and he writes these victory poems, victory songs for people who have won victories in the great Pan-Hellenic games that are all over Greece at this time of the Greek world. And he says all sorts of interesting things. And in this one passage, he talks about the way in which that the race of men, he uses the word genos in Greek, and the race of gods are sort of two separate races. But ultimately, we do go back to a single mother. And you can probably guess who that single mother is. The single mother is, in fact, Gaia, or Gaia, which we can translate as earth. So we are all descended ultimately from a single divine source. So for the ancient Greeks, if you look at the standard sort of accounts of how the world comes into being, which we find in things like Hesiod's Theogony, it's not a created world. It's a world that is procreated. So it assembles itself as an enormous sort of extended family, where the divinities are at the same time, and this is rather puzzling for us, they're both anthropomorphic and they're things. So, Gaia is the earth that we stand on, but she is also a mother and woman. She's also that. And so she can also be visualized and quite correctly as an anthropomorphic thing, an anthropomorphic being that looks like a human woman. It's very, very difficult, I think. A lot of students have struggled with this. The Greeks didn't have much trouble with this. They seem to be able to keep their kind of brains sort of, flipping between the two very, very easily. And so we are like the gods. We have some likeness to them, says Pindar, in both our minds, our intelligence, our nous, and in our sort of strength. He uses the word physis there. So we are like them. We resemble them in some way. And again, that's, I think, a key thing that we'll see even developed by much later philosophical ideas about the nature of human beings. Except, of course, in the Greek idea, we're not actually made and created by gods or God. We are, in fact, we kind of descend from them in some way. Precisely how is not always made terribly clear. Sometimes we just simply spring from the earth. A lot of ancient Greek communities believed that they were earthborn, that they were, they kind of came out of the earth. But let's not forget that the earth is, of course, a goddess. Others, of course, are descended from in some other sort of a slightly adulterated way. It's not quite clear, actually, how human beings come into existence always in the ancient Greek myths. They kind of sort of seem to leave that rather vague. So gods then, do resemble humans, very much so. They're imagined as anthropomorphic. I always think not whenever, because obviously I'm thinking, of different things. But, when I look perhaps when I'm in a non-liturgical setting and I kind of reflect on that wonderful thing in the creed, sort of, I believe in one God. And I kind of think to myself, that would be, of course, for normal pagan Greeks, kind of a bizarre idea. There are so many gods for the ancient Greeks. In fact, there are so many they don't know how many they are. They have names for a lot, hundreds and hundreds, but they just don't know how many there are. There are countless gods. They're everywhere. And in fact, in some of their prayers, you'll see they'll often name gods and have long lists, and then they'll say, and all the other gods that we don't know the names of, in some of their prayers. So, the world is full of gods for them. But the gods are imagined, of course, as being anthropomorphic. And this is a nice example, which strikes me as interesting. This is a particular statue from a sanctuary to Apollo. And you can see perhaps, maybe you can see, I hope so, that in the museum they've actually put Apollo underneath. We now think it's not actually Apollo. It just kind of looks like him. It's actually a votive figurine of a young male, which has been dedicated to the god Apollo, of the kind that you'll see in museums in Athens, the famous Kouros statue format, these are kind of human figurine offerings which are made to sanctuaries in ancient Greek sanctuaries and ancient Greek temples. And so it's of that kind. So it's very easy, of course, if you're not an ancient Greek, to confuse a statue as being a god when actually it's only a human. But there's another one, but this is now the female equivalent of these human figurine offerings. That's because, of course, gods look just like humans. They can be depicted in that way. So, people like Apollo, of course, famously sort of Zeus. Generally, the reason we can tell they're gods very often might be the fact that they're in a particular context, very often a sanctuary or sacral context. But as you all know, also because they have a particular kind of iconography. And the iconography very often communicates something about their, we might say their, I've used rather perhaps trivializing, their sort of portfolio sometimes. So it's their sort of area of their domain, their area of expertise. A word that often crops up in the early poetry, where Zeus distributes these kind of functions and entitlements, uses the word geras, which is a lovely old, really old ancient Greek word, which you find in early Greek poetry, which is, I suppose, a kind of like a sort of a grant or an entitlement. And these things signal, so Zeus of the thunderbolt, for example, as in this figurine. This is a lovely little early figurine in bronze of Athena, Promachos. Again, also the gods might have a particular epithet for a particular sort of, I don't want to call it hypostasis, but a sort of a manifestation. A particular aspect of them is being emphasized in a particular cult or a particular representation. So here we have Athena as warrior goddess. You could, of course, have another representation which signals her as a craft goddess, that kind of thing. So, they can chat, they can be depicted chatting to one another, like Poseidon here, Poseidon very clearly because he's holding a trident. Athena, of course, here in the warrior guise with her helmet. And also, of course, she's got her, the aegis, this sort of thing with snakes on it, this rather odd sort of kind of almost little kind of poncho waistcoat type effect that she often wears. They feast like us, they eat and they drink. So, socially, their social lives are rather similar to us in many respects. And when I us, I keep meaning as if we're ancient Greeks. Of course, I speak as if we're ancient Greeks. So they are often depicted in the same sort of postures, conducting the same sort of day-to-day social things that we humans do. The other interesting thing, of course, is that things that we would regard perhaps as abstractions, as fears, as anything, are actually also gods. This is a lovely depiction of the death of Sarpedon, which occurs in book 16 of the Iliad. We have the god Hermes. Notice his sun hat, because he's traveling a lot. So, of course, if you're sort of outdoors traveling on the roads, you're going to wear a sun hat in ancient Greece. That's precisely what he's often depicted wearing. And we have the gods here. They're so actually depicted very helpfully for us. They're labeled. Otherwise, we probably wouldn't know who they are. They are Thanatos and they are Hypnos. They are sort of sleep and death, and they are carrying the bleeding body of Zeus's son Sarpedon off the battlefield. So even things like sleep and death, of course, can be gods, and other things like fear, phobos, all the great emotions, desire, eros, they're all gods. Even there's even a goddess of seduction, Peitho, persuasion or seduction. She's a goddess who attends on the goddess Aphrodite, for example.
Chrysostom, there's a question
Yes.
from Vian.
Sorry, I missed that question. Sorry.
Just a quick one from my side. Obviously, the Greeks sort of viewed these gods as anthropomorphic people, but to what extent did they actually believe that they existed as real flesh and blood beings?
It's a difficult question to answer. So they have texts which depict the gods being wounded. There's a lovely example, for example, in the Iliad, where the goddess Aphrodite, very inappropriately perhaps, tries to get involved in the battle, and one of the Greek heroes actually sort of nicks her, and she flees, because she's hurt and she's bleeding. So they have depictions of these, but on the other hand, again, I think they're working at different levels. The ancient Greeks are quite normal ancient Greeks as opposed to philosophers. We need to distinguish them, I think. The normal ancient Greeks are quite happy living with inconsistency and paradox. Inconsistency and paradox are actually quite fundamental to their concept of divinity, I think. Speaking off the cuff here a little bit. So I think if you kind of ask a normal sort of peasant, ancient Greek peasant, from say 600 BC, do you think the gods can be wounded? And he'd probably say, well, no, not by me, but maybe a great warrior hero, and they were greater than us in the remote past, in the time of the Trojan War. Those guys probably could, but they were special. They were different from us. So I think that's probably, again, being a bit simplistic, that they might have answered that question. So I think that's the issue, that in some contexts they seem very real, very material. In other contexts, particularly philosophical Greek contexts, they get more and more sort of ethereal, more and more abstract. So a nice example of them being quite material, but also scary, is the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, which is a poem probably composed in the early 500s, maybe 580, 570 BC. No one really knows. And it tells a story of how Aphrodite tricks the Trojan hero Anchises, who's going to be, of course, the father of Aeneas, who goes on, as you know, to help found Rome. Anchises, he tricks him into sleeping with her, and she tricks him into sleeping with her by saying that she's not a goddess. And of course, he does sleep with her, and when he wakes up, he kind of falls asleep after that, and he wakes up, and it's a very different woman from what he saw. So, you know, they obviously are physical in the sense that they can have intercourse with human beings, because Anchises is a human being. But then she clearly is not human when she talks to him in the way she does. And he is absolutely terrified of her. As he says there in this passage, on my knees I beseech you, do not condemn me to dwell among men for the rest of my lifetime, impotent. Pity my manhood. For never a vigorous man is he any more in his lifetime who lies with an immortal goddess. So he realizes with horror what he's actually done. Of course, it wasn't his fault. You know, he actually thought he was sleeping with a woman who wanted to be his wife. She kind of tells a good story, actually, in this the run up to this incident. Another interesting sort of encounter we might sort of look at, again, to give you some idea of how early normal people regarded it. There's this wonderful poet who I mentioned earlier called Hesiod, and we have some of his poetry. He's very important. And he lived in an area which some of you may have visited if you're lucky enough to have gone to Greece. It's in Boeotia, from a little village now, which is called Askra. It's still there, actually. I've looked it up on Google Maps. It's the kind of place I wouldn't mind retiring to. Anyway, Hesiod said it's horrible. Said it's like kind of too cold in winter and too hot in summer. But anyway, I don't know. But I did go to the place where, or the slopes of the place where he recounts an incident that happened to him. And it's actually on the slopes of Mount Helicon. There's actually a monastery there. I went to visit it when I went to a conference. Monastery of St. Lucas on the slopes of Mount Helicon. It's a beautiful, very early Byzantine monastery. And yeah, and he tells this wonderful story about when he was a shepherd looking after his father's goats. He must have been young, because that's the age group that you always give that job to. Suddenly these muses appeared to him, and you know, they actually had a direct kind of interaction with him. And he tells how they said to him, field-dwelling shepherds in noble graces, mere bellies. It's not a very nice thing to say, but you know, they're obviously sort of just scorning human beings, really, because I suppose they think that's what we are. We're just sort of flesh surrounding sort of stomachs, you know, that have to be fed. We know how to say many false things, similar to genuine ones. But we know when we wish how to proclaim true things. So spake great Zeus's ready-speaking daughters. Remember, the muses are the daughters of Zeus, and of course the daughters of Zeus in memory. And they plucked a staff, a branch of luxuriant laurel, of course, a bay tree, a marvel, probably a marvel because, according to Hesiod, it's a branch that maybe never dries. Maybe it's like this evergreen thing. It's a miracle. And they gave it to me, and they breathed the divine voice into me, so that I might glorify what will be and what was before. And they commanded me to sing of the race of the blessed ones who always are, that's of course the gods, but always to sing of themselves first and last. So for Hesiod, the muses are these divinities who have, if you like, come down to earth and have given him a gift. And the gift, of course, has to be used in a particular way. Has to be used to praise and to hymn the gods and to sing about the gods, and also to open any kind of hymn about the gods with some sort of acknowledgement of the muses, and to also close it with the muses as well. So what's interesting in this very early poetry, because this is about 700 BC, we're getting, you know, sort of signs, if you like, of the structure of these things, the structure of the way you talk about gods and to gods. Just keeping an eye on the time here. All right, so perhaps very briefly then, something on and there's far too much to talk about here, so I'm going to be very, very brief and just sort of skip a lot of slides. But things start to change a bit in the roughly about 550 BC thereabouts, when we start to see the emergence of what scholars call philosophy, often associated initially with the Western Turkish coastal communities of ancient Greeks, an area called Ionia. And a key text here, a key sort of thinker, if you like, is actually, he's a poet though, funnily enough. He's not kind of philosophical in the sense he's doing this systematically in prose, but his poetry, of which we only have fragments, we have quotations, preserved from us, remember, ultimately by usually sort of Christian writers. He tells us these interesting things. He makes these claims. He says, for example, you can see the bottom one there, fragment 11, Homer and Hesiod attributed to the gods all the things which are among men are shameful and blameworthy, theft and adultery and mutual deception. So he's particularly worried about the way Homer and Hesiod have represented the gods. He thinks that those things, presumably on the basis that they are by human standards unethical, cannot be true of the gods. And so he comes to these interesting ideas. He says that humans think that gods are born, have clothes and speech and shape like their own. And then this remarkable fragment, but if cows and horses or lions had hands or could draw with their hands and make things that men can make, then horses would draw the forms of gods like horses, etc., etc. So you get the way what he's getting at. What he's getting at is something that we don't have a fragment, but a Christian writer, Clement, much later, actually summarizes something about that. That Xenophanes seems to have intuited that from one point of view, the gods that you sort of know about and kind of encounter in various sort of parts of the world clearly are, or possibly are, culturally determined. So the gods will look like you, if you like. And presumably, as he says, they invent souls for them similar to their own. By that, he probably means cultures. So, that every culture will have actually a different kind of god. That doesn't, Xenophanes seems to be implying that implies that is actually somehow an indication that they can't all be right. There are other solutions to that, but that's the line that he seems to take. And, following on, he comes up with these interesting statements, and no one really knows if he's actually being monotheistic or another distinction, of course, henotheistic. Henotheism being that a recognition that there are lots of divinities, but there's one who really matters, right? So he'll say things like, there is one God greatest among gods and men. That sounds like a henotheistic idea, doesn't it, perhaps? Similar to mortals, neither in shape nor in thought. So Xenophanes goes to this extreme. Instead of sort of saying, well, maybe God is actually like human beings, but maybe, doesn't have different ethnic kind of characteristics. He goes further than that, saying it actually doesn't look like humans at all. And that's a line of thinking that is actually quite sort of, I would say it's quite influential, and we pick it up. Now, again, this is such a vast topic. I'm not going to sort of have chance to talk about it very much, but just some sort of very broad guidelines.
Just to stop you, Chrysostom, don't feel rushed at all. We are very interested, and so you can take your time if you want to continue next time. I take us far into the night, so you're welcome.
Perhaps, well, Father, it's up to you. I mean, I do have enough material for another maybe for another or at least a large part of another talk.
I don't want you to rush through your slides, so just to throw that in there.
All right. So should we just see how far I get by 8 o'clock?
Absolutely. Okay. Maybe even 10 past.
Okay, I hate keeping people because I know people have things to do, but never mind. All right, so this idea then, these sort of, we might call them abstractions, the kind of a tendency to abstract God, the divine. This is a tendency we've seen developing in Socrates and Plato. Again, we only really have, we don't have Socrates' own words. Plato is a very important source for what we think Socrates said. Plato clearly is developing things along his own lines as well. Plato, is really worth studying if you're particularly interested in, say, I don't know, kind of early church theology, because as Father in one of his catechism classes this year was pointing out, if I remember, was it Justin the philosopher, the Saint Justin in the 2nd century AD. I mean, he was initially a Platonist, so Platonism was very, very current actually at the time that many of these early church fathers were developing sort of ways in which to sort of counter, in some ways perhaps, pagan philosophical objections and challenges. So there are several places where Plato's works speak about God. I mean, he speaks about God an awful lot, actually. One of my favorites, of course, is the famous work, The Apology of Socrates. This is the defense speech that Plato claims that Socrates gave in his defense in 399 BC. Remember that Socrates was charged, and this is interesting, isn't it? He was charged with corrupting the young and not having consideration for the gods which the city has consideration for, but for other newfangled divine entities. The Greek phrase there is daimonia kaina. Forgive me, those of you who know, of course, more liturgical Greek and also modern Greek. I tend to use, obviously, the Erasmian, Athenian, sort of classical Athenian pronunciation of the Greek words. Socrates answers a number of ways. And one of the things he does is he calls to witness in his defense the God of one of the ways in which the gods supposedly communicate with humans, which is through oracles. Now, there was a very famous oracle at Delphi connected with the god Apollo. And one of his friends, Socrates' friends, named Chrysostom, went to Delphi one day and asked, is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And the Delphic oracle basically says, no. That's actually all she says. Which I suppose is, if you ask a silly question, as we know, you're going to get a silly answer. But that silly answer impels Socrates to undertake a lifelong search because, and this is very important, I said to myself, what is the God saying? And what is his hidden meaning? I am only too conscious that I have no claim to wisdom, great or small. So what can he mean by asserting that I am the wisest? Those of you who are philosophically minded may already see that Socrates is kind of he's kind of, in a sense, supplying meaning already, because actually all the gods said no, it doesn't mean to say that Socrates is the wisest. Surely it just means that no one is wiser than Socrates, which might mean we're all equally stupid. It's not quite clear, is it? Anyway, he says, and this is very important, because this is what Socrates is convinced of. He cannot be telling a lie because it would not be themis, it would not be right for him. So Socrates starts from these first principles, these unconditional, these are, according to him, they cannot be contradicted. It must be true that God will never lie. Very interesting sort of demand, because ancient Greek literature is full of gods lying. And the gods lie. I mean, we just saw Aphrodite lying to Anchises. He said, Anchises, are you sure you're not a goddess? Because, she said, no, I'm not a goddess, I promise. My father was so-and-so. She lies. So gods always lie. But Socrates, despite that, is convinced they don't. So he kind of sees himself as trying to establish really what the God is trying to say to him. And he comes to this when he cross-examines people and discovers that actually they don't know anything either. But they also, of course, very importantly, don't realize that they don't know anything. He comes to the conclusion, well, in that sense, maybe he is wiser than others. That he's neither wise with their wisdom nor ignorant with their ignorance. So I replied through myself to the oracle that it was best for me to be that I was what I was. He also asks awkward questions of experts. So there's a lovely dialogue which, it's called the Euthyphro. It's very short. It's worth reading. And he asks this individual who's a mantis, of course, as you know, kind of a praying mantis. A mantis is an ancient Greek word meaning basically often translated as prophet or seer. So a seer, a mantis, is normally an expert, an expert in ritual, an expert on what the gods are trying to communicate through signs, through bird signs or something like that, maybe through the entrails of sacrificed animals. And he's trying to get him to sort of explain to him what is holiness and what is unholiness, the Greek words hosion and anosion. And Euthyphro eventually kind of comes up with an answer. He says, well, holiness is what is agreeable to all the gods. And what is not agreeable to all the gods is unholy. All right. The stages, of course, this is particularly problematic, as Socrates says. If you've got a system where there are lots of gods, there are some things maybe that some gods like and other gods don't like. So that's why Euthyphro has to say, okay, so what is holy is what is agreeable to all of them, not, but what some gods like and some gods don't. It's quite a it's quite a funny dialogue, really. So Socrates then makes this further step, and he says to him, okay, so is the holy approved by the gods because it is holy, or is it holy because the gods approve it? So what he seems to be doing there, I'm not very philosophically minded, I'm afraid, but what he seems to be doing there is sort of trying to draw a distinction between what something is versus simply an attribute of a thing. And it's a sort of it's quite an interesting question. It's one, in fact, that the philosophers constantly return to, the ancient Greek philosophers. And of course, Plato is sort of very much, I think, drawn to that in some way, and this sounds a bit bizarre to us, for Plato, there's almost something greater than the gods. There's some standard, there's some criterion which the gods themselves look up to. And that's the sort of move that Plato makes in a variety of ways. So we can see this in one of his great dialogues, which is a very, very long dialogue and very complex, very difficult. And it's, of course, the Timaeus. It's a dialogue some of you might know because it's often drawn upon by people who are very interested in the myth of ancient Atlantis, because Atlantis, of course, is one of the stories told in this dialogue. But, just to sum a couple of things up there. So what emerges from this dialogue is that the world of our experience is a world that has come into being. So it's a world which is corporeal, it's visible, it's tangible, but it also comes into being, it's born, and it sort of passes away. The leaves sprout and the leaves fall, etc., etc. The mountains are eroded. You get the general idea. There are, it's constructed out of these elements of some kind, but at some level, these materials are not the ultimate constituents. There's something underlying them as well. And this is the remarkable thing that Plato does, which in fact is quite unique, actually. And that is the positing of a divine or godly artisan, what he calls the demiurgos, who creates the world. And interestingly, creates the world in such a way that it can be the best thing that it can be, even though it's a thing which is never going to exist forever in a perfect way, but will always be changing and transforming and decaying and being born. So, the Timaeus has this premise that being differs from becoming. Very, very sort of essential idea in the Timaeus, and Plato's very fond of that. And if you have becoming, unlike being, all becoming has a cause. So he seems to try and give the cause of the world of becoming, which is the world we experience, as being caused by a craftsman. And that craftsman is looking to some kind of eternal paradigm, some sort of eternal model, being itself, in order to inform this creation. The creation is going to be imperfect, but the creator, the craftsman, is looking at a perfect thing, if you like, which is sort of beyond this world, outside the world that we experience. And so the outcome is, of course, beautiful. That's why the world is beautiful, but it's not as beautiful as the being. All right. So that's the model that he's looking at. And he kind of goes further. The God who put this world together was, of course, good. And that's why the world we live in is also good, because what is good doesn't have silly things that humans have, like envy. You're not jealous. You don't sort of guard things. You want other people to share, what is wonderful. So he wished all things to be as like himself as possible. That's what the god, the demiurgos, the craftsman sort of did. So finding the visible world in disordered movement, he made it ordered. And it's impossible then for the god to produce anything but the finest that is possible with the sort of restrictions of becoming, if you like. Okay. And the superior thing in this world, the thing which is most, if you like, akin to the perfect and being and the divine, is soul. So it's the soul, if you like, which is the most divine thing, which is in the world. And so the most likely account, says Timaeus in this dialogue, and he uses the word logos there, must say that this world, that is the cosmos, came to be in very truth through God's providence, his pronoia. So the divine creator is constantly sort of thinking ahead, thinking to what the best possible outcome can be with the materials that he has at his disposal in this world of becoming. And so what is produced, the world itself, according to this then, is ultimately a living being with a soul and intelligence. The phrase there in the Greek is zoon emsuchon en noun. All right, a zoon, a creature, an animal, a living being, if you like, ensouled, emsuchon, and having mind in it as well, en noun. All right. So sorry, there's quite a lot going on there. So God made this visible world resemble the most completely perfect of intelligible things. And of course, because he's Plato, what is the most perfect thing, geometrically at least, that you can imagine in this imperfect world? It must be the spherical shape. The spherical shape is not perfect, but it's the most perfect thing in this imperfect world. And of course, also uniform circular motion, which is suited to the nature of this perfect thing. And that's why, you know, you see this wonderful cosmos where all the sky kind of goes round in this fantastic way. So the world is a sort of God. It's a sort of God. It's a sort of it's a sort of a God in becoming, which kind of lasts indefinitely, if not forever. So the world may well be eternal because it's as perfect as it can be, but it's not the perfection itself. So we've nearly finished now. In this world, modeled on its original, there are four kinds of living creature. We have gods in heaven. Now it's interesting. The Timaeus then says that the gods that we Greeks worship, and the Egyptians and the Thracians and the Ethiopians, they are gods, but they are created gods. So the gods that humans worship in normal rituals are created by the divine demiurge, the divine craftsman. It's an interesting idea. In some ways, then, we see the step that he's taking to sort of answer the challenges that earlier thinkers like Xenophanes, as we saw, said about the problem with cultural differentiation between gods and all the creatures in it. But then also the stars, they are living and eternal beings as well. The earth is our divine foster mother, but a created divine foster mother. And then, you know, that's how the world works in this system. So I don't know, Father, whether that might be a convenient place to either stop or to pause.
I think there may be some questions, so maybe it is a good time if the questions go on longer, then we can maybe stick with the questions and then continue next time. It's fascinating. I have a question, but before I ask, would anyone like to ask Chrysostom a question? So if no one, I would like to ask.
Father,
yes,
Father. There's a comment. There's a comment from earlier that's.
Yes. So Chrysostom is a question from Jacob. He says this: Chrysostom, was ancient Greek civilization a last expression of a Bronze Age civilization before Homer, or am I missing something?
Okay. So of course, you know, so Homer talks about sort of, I suppose you could say, sort of traditional sort of songs that have been told about the feats and prowess and events of former times, of ancient times. And for a long time, for the ancient Greeks, Homer, of course, because remember, the ancient Greeks had no scripture. I should have said that sort of earlier on. Again, it's something you probably already know, is pretty obvious. They didn't have scripture, but what they do have, they kind of treated Homer particularly, and Hesiod to a certain extent as well, as a very important testimonies of some of the baselines of their culture, including, if you like, their sort of prehistory. So they regarded Homer as historical, that largely what he was talking about actually did happen. Of course, modern scholars tend to think that that's not the case, but modern scholars have shown, I think, reasonably convincingly, that Homer is actually, at some level, preserving stories and maybe even some events that were going on in the Bronze Age as well. So Homer then, if you like, is a kind of, as a sort of a window with frosting on it a little bit, if you like, into the Bronze Age to a certain extent, because the great the great conflict of the Trojan cycle, which is the Trojan War. I mean, more and more work that's being done now, interestingly, on that part of the world, and the interaction between Greek speakers and speakers of the Anatolian, sort of cultures, the post-Hittite cultures of that part of what is now modern Turkey. That's revealing some very interesting material, actually, about how there was very close interaction culturally and even linguistically between Greeks in the northeast, if you like, of their area, and the descendants of the Hittites. So there's an awful lot of interaction there, and Troy, it does actually turn up in Hittite documents. So there clearly was, in fact, some sort of conflict that actually happened in the past, in the remote past, in the Bronze Age, which was centered at Troy. Yeah. So the Bronze Age then, if you like, does kind of come to an end, and the palace system of civilization also comes to a very abrupt end in about 1100 BC. After that, they talk about sub-Mycenaean, and then they talk about the geometric period, where human settlements become, they're no longer these large palaces. The urbanization, if you want to call it that, is sort of set back a long way. People are living in these little kind of very small settlements, little hamlets. Population seems to have declined, all sorts of things. Yeah.
Are there any other questions?
Oh wow, that's really interesting, because I've heard it on Lord of Spirits, and it was really, really amazing, because they said that the ancient Greeks, they weren't like these what we would think of as a beginning of Western civilization, but they were actually like a the last expression of what the ancient Near East was, but in a different continent, basically. That surprised me.
Yeah. Look, I mean, that's. I think that is a very, very valid perspective, actually, because, what tended to happen, and this is understandable. Everyone does this. If what people tend to do is they try to sort of appropriate and lay claim to things. So for a very, very long time, of course, because say Western Europe in particular, but also Eastern Europe as well, looks to the Greeks and Romans as somehow culturally ancestral, because we have had in the past anyway such great respect for these civilizations and their output. You tend to think of them as ancestral to you in some way. But you're absolutely right. I mean, most scholars, including archaeologists, but particularly archaeologists, when they're looking at Greek culture, particularly up to about, say, even later, I would say 600 BC, 500 BC, most archaeologists would often, I've seen it in literature, in scholarly literature, they talk about the ancient Greeks really as part of what they call, this is the term they use, Near Eastern vernacular. So they use this term in a way where they're kind of saying that, in broad brushstrokes, archaeologically, ancient Greek civilization, at least up to about 500 BC, is sort of not indistinguishable, but falls within that nexus, absolutely, within the kind of nexus of Near Eastern culture. as opposed to, say, it's got a lot more in common with, say, Near Eastern culture than it does, with, say, Celtic culture, with stuff that's going on maybe in, I don't know, central Spain or something like that in 700 BC. That it's definitely not, if you like, Western European, even Western European Bronze Age. And you can see this in Italy. If you look at the archaeology of Bronze Age Italy and the archaeology of Bronze Age Greece, they're very, very different, as I understand it. Bronze Age Greece a lot more in common, as you say, with the Near East than it does with, say, the peninsula of Italy, even though they're, of course, reasonably close to one another. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, thanks.
Maybe a follow-up on that very quickly. I mean, that of course raises very interesting issues about, where did the Greeks in this early period, like Homer and Hesiod, where are they getting their basic kind of formulaic ideas about divinities from? And a lot of work has been done by scholars to show how closely someone like Hesiod's Theogony resembles things that you find in the Hittite versions of generational conflict between gods, which are Babylonian. So Babylonian to Hittite, there's a lot of, and that was felt to be either coincidence or how would you explain it? But this new evidence that's coming out where Greeks are clearly really interacting very closely with the descendants of the Hittites in the early historical period, that makes this kind of cultural and conceptual contact quite plausible that there's some influence on their concept of divinity as a result, which would be a bit different maybe from the divinities that they have, concepts that they've inherited from whatever Indo-European origins there are. And of course, that's I think quite a controversial idea. The idea that there are core Indo-European concepts. By Indo-European, we don't mean, of course, ethnic or racial. We mean linguistic. So the idea might be that your language, to some extent, determines the concept. You might think, and maybe rightly, that's putting the cart before the horse. Maybe the concept determines the linguistic. Yeah, it's a chicken and egg sort of story, really. Yeah. Sorry, I'm probably getting a bit incoherent.
No, absolutely. It's fascinating. I wanted to just make a comment, unless there's some other questions that someone would like to jump in. But the general feeling I get, I don't know if this is a good way, I've heard it being put like this, is what it seems to me, at least in the broader Greek history, history as in the concept of the divine, is that it seems like, in comparison to the Semitic, the biblical experience, the Greeks kind of came to their understanding of the divinity very incrementally through the early mythologies, which was also like, looking at phenomena in nature and things and attributing it to gods, and then with mythologies, and then the philosophers start to ask those questions, like it was Xenophanes, I think.
Yeah.
The higher principles that are, immutable, like God is good or whatever. And they slowly come to this, like, drawing closer and closer to a concept of God that we, as Christians or Jews would have understood. And it seems like the Jews kind of, their experience was very much revealed. They didn't go through, because I was just if you look at the dates, I mean, it's interesting how when the Greek writing started happening, is the prophets were writing, like 800 BC was Isaiah. So it's very early. And the prophets were pretty straight. Like, Isaiah has a pretty clear concept, and he's receiving visions from God directly. And so I almost feel like the Israelites kind of got a free pass there, where they just kind of had a revelation. And I think that was Justin Martyr's his argument why he thought the prophets were great, although he had great respect for the Greek philosophers, especially Plato. But he said, theirs was revealed to them. But I feel that I'm trying to put a question in here. I think that there's great value in the way that the Greeks got close, and I think it created and maybe we can talk about that next time. It put them in a place where they were ready to receive that revelation from the apostles that went out preaching this good news of this great God who kind of embodies all of those things, the idea of the demiurge, the creator of all things, and that but there's a kind of wholeness to God. It's not split up into these various aspects. So I find that interesting, and I think that's why philosophy still continues to be very important in our theology.
Yeah, that's a very perceptive point, Father. Thank you. I mean, and it always strikes me, I kind of always feel a bit sorry for these Greeks, because the ancient Greeks, because they're kind of kept in the dark a lot. And the idea is, I think the overwhelming idea almost is that their gods are always teasing them with knowledge. They even, I mean, that's why I think it's such a wonderful representative quotation when Hesiod has, according to his own story, has a direct, and this is quite rare, has a direct interaction with actual divinities who appear to him on this mountain, and they give him something as well, and they talk to him directly. But even there, they are teasing him. They say, we know how to say many things that are like true things, but are actually false. And if we want to, we know how to say true things as well. And the wonderful, when we do this passage with students, I always say, how is a human being to know when the gods are telling the truth?
Yeah.
And of course, eventually people like Socrates, as far as I can see, more or less just have to come in by themselves and say, God must always tell the truth, because that is what God does. And it's just it's almost like an aspiration, really, which becomes a fact for Plato, a demand, a fundamental demand. And yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Chrysostomos.
Pleasure.
Are there any other questions or comments that anyone would like to make? So, if you would be willing, Basil?
Yes. This of the few things going through my head, but anyway, on that point where Socrates just comes through and is just like, well, God has to tell the truth. Whoever this higher God of gods might be. I mean, I suppose I think, I don't know if this would have been his thinking, but there's something about the fact that in these discussions that did you say Hesiod has?
Yes, with the muses. Yeah.
Well, I mean, the fact that they're even talking about the concept of truth and seem to have some sense that they care about it and there's a standard. It's where does that sense even come from? Where if they were incapable of where would that source of truth come from that one would be able to care about it or judge things against it? But what I was thinking about earlier was I think this goes back to what Jacob was saying about it being the Greeks being better thought of as the last Near East civilization rather than the first Western one. With those interactions with that are sort of are laid out in the Homeric stories about Troy and the Greeks, the idea that Troy is representative of the established civilization, which I suppose would have been some kind of a Hittite thing, and then you have these more sort of wild tribal Greeks coming into the peninsula, starting to cause havoc. But it reminded me of another aspect where the Greeks are they're starting to tease at some of these ideas that point towards a higher ethos that I think becomes more explicit in Christianity, but where I think it's Agamemnon. Is it Agamemnon where he secretly comes to talk to the Trojans, in order.
Oh, you mean Achilles at the end of the Iliad, with
Yeah,
where he actually yeah, they have this sort of kind of reconciliation, very moving reconciliation kind of scene at the end of the Iliad, book 24, maybe.
yeah, where there's a request if they would be willing to
Yes,
provide the
yeah,
body for
yeah,
burial. It's kind of left ambiguous in a sense of like a sense of perhaps we owe mercy to the other, which was sort of radical thought
yeah.
up until that point. But I was wondering if you had any thoughts on some of those other moments where the Greeks are sort of hinting
I
at
mean,
a high
but look,
morality.
I tend to, yeah. Sorry, I don't want to extend this. I know people have to go, but I mean, the thing is that, I mean, look, as you know, I spent basically most of my sort of mental life with these people, in a sense, all my life, really. So I see them very much as people like ourselves. Perhaps, of course, speaking now entirely as an Orthodox Christian, not granted the privileges and the wonderful mercy that we have had, but I think I see them as normal people trying to make the best of things, and like I think most people, I think all people really, trying to do the right thing. So I mean, you do find these throughout, even the earliest Greek texts, where people will. I mean, for example, they've got this whole idea of the suppliant. So the suppliant cannot be touched. When someone actually adopts a suppliant posture, runs up to you and grabs your knees, it doesn't matter what that person has done. That person may have been accused of doing the most atrocious things, like killing children of someone's family, but while they're in their supplications or process, they are sort of sacrosanct, so there are these sorts of protections, the idea of guest friendship. It's you don't harm a guest. A guest comes to your house, you feed them first, you sit them down, you feed them first, and only then do you ask their name and all that kind of stuff. These are very basic, fundamental, almost kind of like international law type sort of views that people have, which you can see clearly articulated in say, Homer's works. Which is not to say people don't do atrocious things. Of course they do. But everybody feels that the way Achilles treats Hector's body when he drags it around and brutalizes it and refuses to bury it, everyone, all the Greeks and the Trojans, Greeks as well, his own friends, think that's not the way to treat a dead body. They've got their own standards and criteria. So they, yeah. So I mean, I have a lot of time for these people. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just there was one bit I don't understand. Was it when someone adopts a certain sort of posture?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a lot of I suppose, like today, there's a lot of performance posture. It's a very performative society, absolutely, as ours increasingly is. When I was first lecturing, everyone was going, "Oh, the Greeks were so different from us. They're always performing emotion, performing virtue, and all that sort of stuff." It's kind of the same now. Everyone's sort of performing on these sort of TikTok. So I don't think we're really that different in many respects.
I've heard of we've had sort of the age of logos has kind of been eroding, and pathos is kind of re-emerging.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Chrysostomos. This has been fascinating, and I'm looking forward to the follow-up. Yeah, I'd love to continue, and also maybe look at some overlaps of also, still in the Orthodox terminologies. We still use Greek words that, like soteria, thanatos, death, salvation, which were, gods in the ancient Greek understanding.
Yeah, because I've got, sorry, on the later slides, I've got the Lord's Prayer, and I've got a prayer by a Stoic philosopher, and some interesting connections.
Oh yes, so we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much. It's been a
Sorry.
great privilege. And
Okay.
we'll prepare our questions for next time as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much for
God
listening.
bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.